and the 9 guest countries. There were 13 international organizations that were represented at the meeting. We had the presence of foreign ministers of 27 countries, apart from India, the chair. And 2 countries, the Republic of Korea and Japan, were represented at the Vice Minister, the Minister of State level, which I believe is actually the largest gathering of foreign ministers hosted by the G20 presidency. Now, in the morning, we were addressed by the Prime Minister virtually, and I think some of that is on public, actually that is on public record, right? And for those of you who may not have seen it, he gave us some pretty forthright advice and I would say strong guidance on what the foreign ministers should do at the meeting. If I were to sum up what the Prime Minister told us, there were 5, to my mind, important points. One, he noted that multilateralism is in a crisis today, and in terms of preventing future wars and fostering international cooperation, which were its 2 primary tasks, it had failed. The second point he had made was that it was important to give a voice to the global south because the world was seeing a lot of countries actually regressing on their sustainable development goals pathway. We were witnessing unsustainable debt. These were countries who were most affected by global warming, and therefore it was particularly important to hear them. The third point he made was that the discussions, which we were just beginning at that time, he recognized that these discussions were affected by the geopolitical tensions of the day. But he asked us all as foreign ministers to remember that we had a responsibility for those who were not in the room. And therefore, he urged that we draw inspiration from India's civilizational ethos and focus not on what divides us, but on what unites us. He then spoke about the challenges that we should address, which included, of course, the impact of the pandemic, the lives lost in natural disasters, the breakdown of global supply chains, debt and financial crisis, challenges of resilience in healthcare systems, in infrastructure, in economies. And finally, he asked us as foreign ministers to trust in our collective wisdom and ability and to rise above our differences. So I mentioned this at some length because this was very much the spirit in which we approached the discussions today. Now, we had 2 sessions really of meetings, and the topics range from strengthening multilateralism, ensuring food and energy security, development cooperation, and the second session was on counterterrorism, global skill mapping, humanitarian assistance and disaster response, as well as women-led development. Now, the G20 ministers, after the discussions today and the negotiations which preceded it, we have agreed to issue a common position where the G20 as a group has come together and arrived at a consensus on many important issues. So this has been adopted this afternoon as a chair's summary and outcome document. This would hold us in good stead as we move forward with other working group meetings of the presidency and, of course, in preparation for the summit which would take place in September. Now, what I'd like to do is really share some of the key takeaways from the outcome document and our discussions. These include, one, of course, the strong sentiment with G20 countries expressed on the need to strengthen multilateralism in the context of the dramatic changes in the global order. The G20 recognized in the context of the UN the essentiality of reforms and the need for reinvigorated multilateralism. The important principles of international development cooperation, such as host country ownership, equal partnerships, tailoring such cooperation efforts with local needs. These were some aspects highlighted by the G20. They also touched upon the need for MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to mobilize additional financing and welcomed efforts to provide additional financing for sustainable development goals. The outcome document also stresses upon the need to have reliable food and fertilizer supply chains, as well as resilient and sustainable energy supply chains. In the context of global food and energy insecurity, this, we believe, is a very important message. I would also like to highlight that the foreign ministers unequivocally condemned terrorism in all forms and manifestations and recognized that all acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable. They called for strengthening of efforts to deny safe havens to terrorist groups, freedom of operations, movement and recruitment, as well as financial, material, or political support. The G20 also reflected upon the threats arising from the misuse of new and emerging technologies and highlighted the importance of strengthening international cooperation in that regard. For the first time, the G20 foreign ministers considered and discussed the topic of counter-narcotics and called for inclusive and strong international cooperation in this regard. They also discussed the topic of global skills mapping, and this was in the context of the changing nature of work. They recognized that well-integrated, skilled workers benefit not only in their country of origin, but also the destination country where they may happen to be employed. The G20 also accepted the need to strengthen international cooperation in the field of humanitarian assistance and disaster risk reduction. This will be further discussed in the working group on this particular subject, which has been newly set up by the Indian presidency. Now, as you all know, women-led development is one of the key priorities of the Indian presidency, and it has been personally highlighted by the Prime Minister. After due deliberations on the G20 table, the foreign ministers affirmed the need to put gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, including their leadership, at the core of our efforts for inclusive recovery. Important discussions on global health were also held. The statement, the outcome document I'm talking about, highlights the need for strengthening key aspects of global health architecture, support for the pandemic fund, and continued political attention to global health. It stresses the need for implementing the One Health approach. The foreign ministers addressed climate action in the context of common but differentiated responsibilities and urged developed countries to fulfill their commitments to deliver on the goal of jointly mobilizing $100 billion per year urgently and through to 2025 to tackle climate change. Now, despite the challenges of the divergent positions on the conflict in Ukraine, the G20 foreign ministers were able to come to a consensus on addressing these key challenges that I have just mentioned. As the Prime Minister urged, we did indeed focus more on what unites us than what divides us. You would also see that it has been our endeavor to ensure that the voice of the Global South is heard on the G20 table, and that is why India had organized the Voice of the Global South Summit in January this year, in which I think 125 countries participated. So the agenda for the foreign ministers meeting, as well as the outcome document, has very clearly taken forward the priorities of the Global South. We are also particularly glad that to see so many of our friends and partners from the Global South on the table because India, as President, had invited them. I would also like to point out that today's sessions commenced with a moment of silence to pay respect to those who lost their lives in the recent earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Ahead of our deliberations in today's first session, as I told you, the Prime Minister gave his virtual address to the foreign ministers. I would like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to all G20 members, to all the participating delegations, obviously to our own team working on it, for the support which they have given to the priorities of the presidency, for the efficient holding of today's meeting. We believe that the outcome document is truly a reflection of G20's commitment to face global challenges squarely and collectively. The G20 Foreign Ministers, along with the ministers from the guest countries and heads of delegations from international organizations, will be calling upon the Prime Minister very shortly, in fact, immediately after this press conference. So this really, in summary, is a sense of what was discussed today, what was negotiated amongst the G20 members, and the chair's summary and outcome document will, of course, be released in due course. So I think, Arindam, that should pave the way for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for a detailed and comprehensive perspective, sir. Some ground rules before I open the floor for questions. Please introduce yourself and the organization that you represent. Please note, we will try to limit questions to one per organization outlet. We will also be grouping questions. And finally, we have a very hard cut on time, as Honorable Minister mentioned. He has to go somewhere, so please don't be disappointed. Let me start with a few hands here. 1 second. I saw the hand up there first. Sudhi, why don't you start?
Sir, Shruti Ranjan from Bloomberg. So if you could give us an understanding as to why the foreign ministers could not come to a consensus. We know India was trying very hard to convince everybody, in fact China and Russia, to kind of agree on this. Where did the hurdle come up? If you could give us an understanding. Thank you.
Okay. Ma'am, here on the right.
Thank you. Barbara Platt-Usher from the BBC. The Russians issued a statement after a meeting between China and Russia on the sidelines of the event, in which they criticized the West for employing blackmail and threats and interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. And I was wondering whether that had any impact on your efforts to come to a joint communique, or I know you've highlighted that you were able to deal with the issues you wanted to find consensus on, but to what degree did that affect the discussions? And to just clarify that a chair summary is not a joint communique, and whether you felt that you fell short of your expectations in terms of what you might have been able to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Right here. Yeah.
Sir, Rishikesh from PTI. So my question is the Russia-Ukraine conflict potentially derailing aspirations of a global South under India's presidency, sir? And especially India's concerns about Indo-Pacific region, Chinese aggression.
Sorry,
in the Indo-Pacific region.
Could you clarify your question? Sorry.
My question is
You
the Russia...
got it. Okay, fair enough. Siddhant, go ahead.
So Siddhant from Vion, sir, do you think that Siddhant from Vion, my question is, do you think the Russia-Ukraine conflict is potentially paralyzing the grouping because of the divide between Russia and the West? And my second question, what was your meeting with the Chinese foreign minister?
The first question has already been asked. I'll take that as the second one. Sir, to you.
Okay. In a sense, the first three questions cover a very similar area, so I'm really clubbing it together. I'll ignore your first question because you're allowed only one, so I'll take the China question. The picture which I was sharing with you was the G20 delegations, members, the negotiators, the ministers. We met, we discussed, the officials also obviously negotiated. Now, there were a very large number of issues on which there was agreement. And in fact, if you look at, the detailed picture that I have presented to you, there was agreement on various aspects of strengthening multilateralism, on promoting food and energy security, on climate change, climate action, ensuring biodiversity, on gender issues, on global health, on counter-terrorism, on new emerging technologies, counter-narcotics, how do we go about with development cooperation. So there are, I would say, I don't want to put a percentage on it because that's not a fair way of depicting, a collection of issues. But do appreciate that on the bulk of the issues which concern especially the global south, the developing countries, there was a considerable meeting of minds, and a considerable meeting of minds which has been captured by the outcome document. Now, the question, why was, did we fall short of expectations? Why is it called what it is? If we had had a perfect meeting of minds on all issues and captured it fully, then obviously it would have been a collective statement. But there were issues, and I think the issues, I would say very frankly, concerned the Ukraine conflict, on which there were divergences. So on the bulk of the issues, we were able to get an outcome document. There was a chair summary because there were differences on the Ukraine issue which we could not reconcile between various parties who held differing positions. Now, is the conflict impacting the global south? Of course it is. I mean, it's not something new. In fact, India has been saying this very strongly for pretty much close to a year, that this is affecting. In fact, today in my own session, I actually used the word saying for much of the global south, this is a make or break issue. That the costs of fuel, the cost of food, the cost of fertilizer, the availability of fertilizer, which means next year's food, these are all extremely pressing issues. And if you see some of the countries who were already struggling with debt, who were already impacted by the pandemic, for them, this conflict, the knock-on effects of this conflict coming on top of that, has been really, damaging is a very, very mild word. So it is a matter of very, very deep concern for us, which is why we have kept the focus in this meeting very much on the concerns of the global south. We feel these are the most vulnerable countries. It's not realistic, it's not credible to talk about the future of the global economy and the multilateral order if we are not able to really address and focus on the issues of those who are most in need. So that's been broadly the approach. So just to sum up, I would say in terms of the outcome document, which we will be putting out very, very shortly, you will see that, the bulk, there is, almost, I would say, 95% in terms of paragraph agreement. And it is just on 2 paragraphs that we were not able to get everybody on the same page or same para, as you might call it. On the China meeting, I met Minister Chingang on the sidelines of the conference this afternoon. It's our first meeting after he took over as foreign minister. So we spent, I don't know, maybe about 45 minutes talking to each other. And the bulk of our conversation, understandably, was about the current state of our relationship, which many of you have heard me describe as abnormal. And I think those were among the adjectives that I used in that meeting. We have, there are real problems in that relationship that need to be looked at, that need to be discussed very openly and candidly between us. That's what we sought to do today. We also had a brief discussion on what was happening in the G20 framework, but the thrust of the meeting was really on our bilateral relationship and the challenges in the bilateral relationship, especially that of peace and tranquility in the border areas.
Sorry, let me take another round of questions, if you have, sir.
Yeah, one more round.
Okay. There, yes, please. No, there, please.
Dr. Jaishankar, Mujib Bashar from the New York Times. Although the statement may have fallen short, as you said, because of divergent opinions, in the context of the role that India could play to bring the sides together on the Ukraine war, there are reports that Secretary Blinken and Sergei Lavrov may have met on the sidelines of G20. Are these the kind of positive efforts that did happen, and India facilitate conversations like that to bridge the gap? Would you confirm that?
One second. Akhilesh, go ahead. Akhilesh, yeah, microphone.
Sir, I'm Akhilesh Suman from Sunset TV. You told about global skill mapping and related issue. What do you mean by that, and how it was discussed, and what is the outcome on this?
I had one question there. Sorry, yeah, please, yeah. Yes, sir. No, not you, behind you.
Good afternoon. I'm Emerson Lim from Central News Agency of Taiwan. As most countries are focusing on Russia-Ukraine conflict, Taiwan Strait is also another flash point in this region. So, is the Taiwan Strait issue discussed during the meeting, and is the G20 ministers, or at least the Quad ministers, taking steps to prevent the tensions from escalating? Thank you.
Thank you.
One more.
Neeraj, last one.
सर, नीरज हूँ न्यूज 18 इंडिया से। हमारा सवाल यह है कि अभी 2 बैठकें हुई G20 वित्त मंत्रियों की और विदेश मंत्रियों की बैठक में कोई ज्वाइंट स्टेटमेंट नहीं आ पाया। बाली घोषणा पत्र में भारत की भूमिका अहम थी। प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी के शब्दों को इस्तेमाल किया गया और भारत की कोशिश से वो हो सका था कि बाली डिक्लेरेशन जारी हो सका। अब आने वाले महीनों में क्या कोशिश होगी कि समिट में एक ज्वाइंट डिक्लेरेशन आ सके, सभी लोगों के बीच यूक्रेन मसले पर सहमति बन सके?
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, I wouldn't put it the way you put it, that the statement fell short. I mean, there are in diplomacy occasions when you are able to get 20 countries to agree on everything. There are occasions when you don't. So, for me, the primary objective of this meeting and of our presidency was really to highlight what were the key problems facing the global economy, especially the problems faced by the more vulnerable economies of the world. Now, if you, as I said, and when you look at the outcome document, you will see this for yourself. The bulk of the issues which are concerning developing countries, I think they were very satisfactorily addressed. I mean, it's not like we can give instantaneous solutions, but I think the thinking, the policy prescriptions, the commitments, the mindset were all absolutely on the right direction. So, yes, on one particular issue, because of very polarized views of some countries, we were not able to bridge it on this particular occasion. Whereas, as our colleague pointed out from there, we were able to do that with, a number of us were able to do that collectively in Bali. But obviously, the Bali situation today, for whatever reason, some countries feel cannot be extrapolated. So I would urge you really to look on the fact that substantively on the key development issues of debt, issues of finance, issues of food, issues of fuel, issues of health, issues of climate. In fact, this meeting was able to get everybody around the table. And as I said, this is no easy task given the state of polarization in the world. On your question about global skills mapping, essentially today there is a growing demand in the developed world for skills and talents. there is a growing availability, but they are not necessarily in the developed world. Much of that availability is in the developing world. So how do you match the demand and supply for the benefit of the global economy? That is the really crucial issue. For a country like India, which has significant human resources, and which fortunately now has a government which pays attention to the development of those human resources, which actually focuses on skills and talent and innovation and education. This is an opportunity for us. So especially in the last 9 years, we have also been looking at what are called mobility and migration partnership, which allow for legal mobility, which ensure that talent and skills which go out get the same treatment in those particular geographies as their own citizens, and which ensure that all of this is legal and free of any sort of illegal activities. Now, it's not just India. I'm citing India because we are among the countries where, very active in this. But there are other countries as well. So this is widely recognized. In fact, in today's intervention, I'm not, I think the etiquette is that you don't specifically say what, individual ministers said. But I can tell you that some of the relevant international organizations and some of the other ministers there spoke at some length about the importance of how do you ensure, smooth mobility, how do you ensure protected mobility, legal mobility, because this is today one of the big issues before the international economy. On the Taiwan Straits issue, I think the answer is very simple. No, the matter was not discussed today. जो आपका जो सवाल है कि बाली में हम लोग जो हैं उस समय माने हमारे कारण ही नहीं, हम सब मिलके, हमारा योगदान तो था ज़रूर उसमें कि हम लोग उस समय वहाँ सहमति बना पाए. अब क्या हुआ है कि बाली के बाद अभी जो है दुनिया में काफ़ी कुछ घटनाएं हुई हैं. अब जो G20 के सदस्य जो हैं, जो इस मुद्दे के साथ जो जुड़े हुए हैं, उनके इस मामले में अलग अलग विचार हैं. और हम जो हैं इस बार उनके विचार माने उनके बीच में इतना गैप था कि हम लोगों ने प्रयास तो की, पर प्रयास के बावजूद हम जो हैं इस समय सहमति बना नहीं पाए. तो आप देखेंगे कि जैसे हमने बेंगलोर में किया था, वैसे ही जो बाली में जो तय हुआ है उसी को हमने दोहराया है. और हमारी जो सोच है कि G20 के ज़्यादा सदस्य जो हैं वो अभी भी बाली के जो आउटकम जो था उसके साथ वो जुड़े हुए हैं. So essentially he asked me saying, he asked me saying that why were you not able to carry forward what happened in Bali, and I explained that, given the state of polarization, given presumably developments which have happened since then, we found that positions were very far apart, and we tried very hard. We were not the only country who tried. The G20 works very, very collectively, but we were not able to bridge the gap. But, I want to conclude by highlighting one very important point. In the past, for quite a few years now, G20 foreign ministers have met. This is the first time that the G20 foreign ministers have produced an outcome document. The outcome document, I think, reflects consensus and cooperation and collaboration on a very vast number of issues that are particularly important today for the international community, for the global south. So very frankly, I think it's a good day's work that we have done, and I'm very happy to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you also, Foreign Secretary, sir, and Su Sherpa Abhay. Thank you all for joining us today. Good evening.